An Iranian-linked strike hits a U.S. base in Iraq, just hours after Washington suddenly paused Project Freedom. And instead of calming tensions, the region appears to move even closer to the edge.
As reports of additional strikes begin circulating across Iraq, the situation becomes even more unpredictable. Some of these incidents are linked to Kurdish regions, adding another layer of complexity, because now multiple groups are being pulled into the instability. What makes this moment feel different is the speed at which everything escalates. There is no long buildup, no gradual warning signs, just a rapid shift from paused operations to renewed conflict activity. And as this unfolds, analysts begin questioning whether this is a coordinated response or a symbolic message meant to test reactions. Because in conflicts like this, timing often carries as much weight as the action itself. The idea that this strike comes immediately after a U.S. operational pause creates the impression that the situation is still highly reactive and unstable, rather than controlled or contained. But what makes this even more significant is that this is only the opening movement in a much larger chain of events. Because while the strike grabs attention, behind the scenes, an entirely separate development is collapsing in real time.
The second development centers around the sudden breakdown of Project Freedom, a U.S.-led initiative that was expected to play a major role in reshaping regional pressure. But almost as quickly as it is announced, the entire structure begins to fall apart. The key issue isn't battlefield resistance, it's diplomatic access. Saudi Arabia, one of the most important regional players in the equation, refuses to grant the United States access to its airspace and military bases. This decision immediately changes everything. Without airspace clearance or logistical support, the operation cannot function as intended. The U.S. had reportedly planned for coordinated regional cooperation, but instead it faces unexpected resistance from a key ally. The refusal is not just a minor setback, it effectively blocks the operational pathway required for the plan to move forward. What makes this even more striking is the context behind it. Reports suggest that the announcement of the operation was made without full coordination with regional partners, creating tension before implementation even began. This lack of alignment leads to frustration among Gulf states, who feel blindsided by the speed and method of the announcement. As a result, what was supposed to be a coordinated strategic move turns into a suspended operation almost overnight. The collapse of Project Freedom doesn't just reflect military limitations, it exposes the fragile nature of regional cooperation under pressure. And while this plan disappears from the table, attention quickly shifts to something far more complex, a series of conflicting diplomatic demands being exchanged behind closed doors.
The third development pulls the focus away from military action and into the world of high-stakes diplomacy. At the center of it all is a one-page document reportedly outlining U.S. demands directed at Iran. But what immediately stands out is not just what is included in the document, but the fact that there are multiple versions circulating, each with slightly different conditions. One version described in reports takes a very strict approach. It includes long-term restrictions on uranium enrichment, demands for the handover of enriched nuclear material, dismantling of key nuclear facilities, and acceptance of strict inspection protocols. On paper, this version represents a full-scale rollback of Iran's nuclear capabilities, designed to prevent any future development potential. However, what is noticeably missing from this version is just as important. There is little to no emphasis on regional proxy networks or ballistic missile programs, which have historically been central points of tension in negotiations. This raises immediate questions about whether the document reflects a complete strategy or just a selective framework focused on nuclear limitations. At the same time, the existence of multiple reported versions creates confusion. Different media outlets present slightly different structures, making it unclear which version, if any, represents the official position. This lack of clarity adds uncertainty to an already fragile negotiation environment. And just as analysts begin trying to interpret these conflicting demands, another framework emerges, one that suggests a very different kind of agreement might actually be taking shape behind the scenes.
The fourth point introduces a completely different interpretation of the negotiations, shifting away from rigid demands toward a more flexible, temporary framework. According to reports, the White House may be approaching a one-page memorandum of understanding with Iran that is not a final peace deal, but rather a structured pause designed to keep negotiations alive. In this version of events, Iran would agree to temporarily halt nuclear enrichment activities while talks continue. This includes a freeze on movement of enriched materials and restrictions on nuclear-related operations during the negotiation period. In exchange, the United States would reportedly consider easing certain sanctions and releasing portions of frozen Iranian funds, creating immediate economic relief. Another major element discussed in this framework is the potential reopening of key trade routes, including maritime corridors like the Strait of Hormuz. This adds an economic dimension to the agreement, suggesting that both sides are attempting to stabilize not just military tensions, but also critical energy and trade flows. However, the most controversial aspect of this arrangement is the timeline. The framework introduces a 30-day negotiation window to reach a more detailed and permanent agreement. If no deal is reached within that period, the situation could either reset or escalate again, depending on how both sides respond. Critics argue that this structure may give away leverage too early, while supporters see it as a necessary step to prevent immediate escalation. But even as this debate unfolds, signals from leadership suggest that the possibility of failure is very much on the table.
The fifth point shifts the tone as political leadership begins signaling uncertainty about the outcome of negotiations. Public statements and reported remarks from U.S. leadership emphasize that if Iran agrees to certain conditions, escalation could be avoided, but if it does not, military pressure could return. This creates a very direct conditional framework: diplomacy on one side, escalation on the other. There is little room for ambiguity in the messaging. The language used suggests that the situation is still considered highly unstable and that negotiations are not guaranteed to succeed. What stands out here is that even while diplomatic channels remain open, military readiness is not being reduced. Instead, it appears to remain part of the broader strategy, acting as a background pressure point influencing negotiations. This dual-track approach, talking while preparing for escalation, keeps the situation in a constant state of tension. At the same time, there are concerns raised internally about whether any agreement reached would actually hold. One of the key risks highlighted is fragmentation within Iran's internal power structure, where different factions may respond differently to any external deal. And while leadership debates the risks of failure, another layer of diplomacy begins to emerge, involving third-party nations trying to influence the outcome from outside the main negotiation table. The sixth point expands the scope of the situation beyond just the United States and Iran, introducing other global and regional players into the equation. Iran's foreign minister is reported to have engaged in diplomatic visits to China, suggesting that Beijing may play a behind-the-scenes role in shaping negotiation dynamics. At the same time, Pakistan emerges as a communication channel, helping facilitate indirect messaging between involved parties. This creates a multi-layered diplomatic structure, where information and proposals are not moving through a single direct channel, but through several intermediaries. This broader involvement reflects the global importance of the situation. The outcome is not just relevant to regional stability, but also intersects with wider geopolitical competition, especially between major global powers. As a result, Iran becomes part of a much larger strategic picture that includes economic influence, energy routes, and international alliances. What makes this phase particularly important is timing. These diplomatic movements coincide with upcoming high-level international meetings involving the United States and China. This overlap raises questions about whether progress on Iran is being influenced by broader geopolitical negotiations happening simultaneously. And while global actors position themselves, internal conditions inside Iran continue to deteriorate under mounting pressure. The seventh point brings attention back inside Iran,
where economic and social pressure is becoming increasingly visible. Reports describe rising inflation, unstable currency conditions, and continuous increases in the cost of everyday goods. What makes this situation more intense is not just the numbers, but the speed at which changes are happening. Prices of basic necessities are reportedly shifting rapidly, creating uncertainty for both consumers and businesses. Small shop owners describe an environment where planning ahead becomes nearly impossible because costs fluctuate constantly. Even essential goods like food items and transportation resources are affected by this instability. At the same time, official statements acknowledge economic strain and warn against hoarding and market manipulation. This public acknowledgement itself is seen as an indicator that internal pressure is significant enough to require direct government response. However, despite these warnings, many citizens reportedly feel that conditions are not improving. Instead, there is a growing sense of stagnation, where even pauses in conflict do not translate into economic relief. Some estimates suggest that recovery, if it begins, could take years to stabilize. And this growing internal pressure feeds directly into the final and most important question shaping everything happening externally.
The final point brings everything together into a broader question about where the situation is actually heading. At this stage, there are multiple possible outcomes being discussed, ranging from a full diplomatic agreement to a partial framework that delays conflict, or even a complete breakdown that could restart escalation. But what becomes increasingly clear is that none of these outcomes are guaranteed. Instead, the most likely scenario appears to be a cycle of temporary arrangements, extensions, and ongoing negotiations that prevent immediate resolution while avoiding total collapse. This creates a situation defined not by resolution, but by sustained pressure. Each side continues to maintain leverage, which makes compromise difficult and final agreements uncertain. Even when temporary progress is made, it remains vulnerable to reversal if conditions change. As a result, the conflict environment becomes less about single decisive moments and more about extended tension over time. The situation doesn't move in a straight line. It shifts, pauses, and restarts depending on political, military, and economic pressures. And that leads to the central takeaway. What is unfolding is not just a single crisis with a clear ending, but an ongoing system of negotiation, pressure, and strategic calculation where the final outcome is still very far from decided.